Beneath the calm surface of a seemingly ordinary life, a young black woman faces a brutal betrayal that shatters everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and survival. Thrust into a world where greed wears the mask of kinship and a hidden fortune threatens to vanish forever, she battles not only against ruthless relatives, but against a system stacked against her at every turn. The truth she uncovers isn't just shocking, it's explosive, rewriting her past and threatening her future in ways no one could have imagined. This is a story of fierce determination, raw injustice, and unbreakable bonds forged in the darkest fires. If you're ready to witness a fight for justice unlike any other, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? And what part of this fight moves you the most? It was supposed to be a peaceful fall break, the kind where Rachel could escape midterms, rest, maybe catch up on college reading, and spend some real time with her family in the cozy, old Monroe home that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine cleaner. But instead, she woke to the wail of sirens and the sting of smoke clawing her lungs. Firefighters pulled her back from the collapsing porch as the roof caved in on itself, flames swallowing the kitchen Rachel had learned to bake cookies in when she was 10. Hours later, as sunlight cut through the haze, a coroner quietly confirmed what she already feared. Her parents, Nathan and Claire Monroe, were gone. They hadn't made it out. The gas leak had built silently, unnoticed until it was too late, until a light switch flipped and everything changed forever. In the days that followed, Rachel moved like a ghost. She arranged funerals, signed papers she couldn't comprehend, made sure her brothers were fed and clothed and distracted. Carter, the oldest of the boys, tried to play strong, taking on chores and looking after Eli and Noah. But Rachel saw the grief bleeding through in the way he flinched when someone touched his shoulder, or how long he stared at their father's watch sitting untouched on the counter. Eli withdrew into his headphones, while Noah clung to Rachel like a shadow, asking if Mom and Dad were still asleep. Rachel didn't have the heart to say no again. With a mountain of paperwork and the urgent need to make things official, she began filing for emergency guardianship. She figured it was just a formality. She was their sister, after all. They needed her. She never imagined anyone would challenge that. Then, on the third morning after the funeral, the doorbell rang. She answered in a sweatshirt and leggings, dark circles under her eyes, expecting another neighbor with condolences. Instead, two tall men in tailored coats stepped through the frame like shadows. Douglas and Harvey Wells, her mother's estranged brothers. She hadn't seen either of them since she was 12. Between them stood a slick man in a gray suit with a briefcase, introducing himself as Mark Dresden, probate attorney. They didn't ask how she was holding up. They didn't ask about the boys. Douglas went straight to business. We're here to settle the estate. Rachel stared at them in disbelief as Dresden laid out documents on the dining table her father had built by hand the summer Rachel turned 11. The attorney explained matter-of-factly that because no valid will had been located, the estate was now under the jurisdiction of the probate court, and Douglas and Harvey, as the next adult blood relatives, had filed a motion to assume temporary custody and asset control. Rachel objected immediately. "I already filed for guardianship," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've been caring for them since the accident." Dresden gave her a tight-lipped smile. "Unfortunately, at 19, the court may view you as legally dependent, not a suitable guardian." Harvey chimed in, casually dismissive. "It's for the best, Rachel. We have the resources. The court will understand." She wanted to scream. Instead, she demanded they leave. That night, she stayed up reading Connecticut family law on her phone, heart racing with panic. She called every legal aid office she could find, most of them already closed. By morning, she hadn't slept, but she had hope until a knock came again. This time, two officers stood with a court order. Rachel's emergency petition had been stalled for review, and Douglas and Harvey's motion had been approved. They now had temporary custody of the minors and control of the estate pending a formal hearing. She begged the officers to reconsider, pleaded with Douglas, even tried to physically block the staircase as Carter yelled from above. But the law didn't care. She was given 30 minutes to pack. The boys cried. Carter clenched his fists. Eli threw a picture frame against the wall. Noah hugged her legs and refused to let go. "I'll come back for you," she whispered over and over, like a prayer. As she loaded a backpack and duffel bag into her car, she could barely breathe. She drove away from the house she had grown up in without knowing where to go. That night, in a dim motel room off I-95, she found a crumpled note Noah had slipped into her coat pocket. Written in green crayon, it read, "Don't give up. We still need you." She stared at it for a long time, folded it neatly, and placed it in her wallet. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. Rachel found a weekly rental in a sketchy part of Yonkers and a job at a greasy diner that paid cash under the table. She dropped out of NYU. She lived day by day, shift by shift, saving money and collecting documents. But something didn't sit right. How had the house sold so quickly after the explosion? And now, with the court order hanging like a curse in her backseat, she was utterly alone, stripped of her rights, her family, and her home, all within 72 hours. Her phone buzzed with messages from NYU's registrar about tuition deadlines and re-enrollment, but Rachel didn't even open them. She knew she wasn't going back. Her future had been torched along with the dining room her father had built. After sleeping in her car for 3 nights, once in a gas station lot, once behind a bowling alley, and once in a church parking space where a security guard eventually shooed her off, Rachel stumbled upon a handwritten sign taped to a convenience store window in Yonkers. Weekly room, private bath, $170 cash. It was the closest thing to shelter she could afford. The room, a converted storage closet above a noisy laundromat, smelled like bleach and mildew, but the door locked, the faucet worked, and the tiny twin bed didn't sag too much. Rachel handed over the cash she had left, locked the door behind her, and sat on the floor beside her single window. She stayed there until sunrise, knees drawn to her chest, crumpled note from Noah clenched in one hand. That note became her lifeline. It reminded her that someone was still counting on her, even if she had nothing left to give. She needed work, fast. The next morning, she walked up and down Central Avenue looking for help wanted signs. She had no resume, no time for interviews, and no patience for rejections. At a 24-hour diner called Patsy's Grill, she asked the manager directly if they needed hands. He took one look at her eyes, sunken but determined, and handed her an apron. She started that night, scraping plates, wiping tables, and washing dishes until her fingertips wrinkled and her shoulders ached. She worked the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 a.m., 6 days a week. After a week, the cook started slipping her leftover pancakes and fries before closing. After 2 weeks, she had memorized the regulars, late-night taxi drivers, exhausted nurses, and delivery workers who tipped in crumpled bills and kind words. By the 3rd week, her palms blistered from scouring pans, but her rent was paid. She had stability, at least in the form of a lock and a paycheck. But stability wasn't the same as security. Every cent she earned was either spent on rent, food, or kept in a Ziploc bag under her mattress. She couldn't afford a checking account. Her phone bill lapsed. She lost access to email. Her college portal locked her out. When NYU sent a notice of academic dismissal, it landed in an inbox she no longer had the password to. But even as her former life dissolved, Rachel didn't collapse. She couldn't. Her focus narrowed to one thing: her brothers. She needed to know they were okay. Her calls to Douglas and Harvey went unanswered. When she tried visiting the Monroe house, now technically theirs, she was threatened with a trespassing report. At one point, she waited outside the local middle school just to catch a glimpse of Noah walking out of the building. She saw him. He looked smaller somehow, paler. A teacher spotted her and called the office. Rachel had to leave before someone called the police. That night, she broke down. For the first time since the explosion, she sobbed. Not pretty, cinematic crying, but guttural, hopeless, full-body grief. When it ended, she wiped her face, stared at the ceiling, and whispered, "I'll find a way." It was a vow, not to herself, but to Carter, Eli, and Noah. She couldn't protect them physically, not yet. But she could prepare. She could study. Every day after her shifts, she dragged herself to the public library near Getty Square and read Connecticut probate law until her eyes blurred. She learned about intestate succession, custodial disputes, forged wills, and financial fraud. She began taking notes, building timelines, and cross-checking property records. Every lead led to another question. How had the house been sold in a week? Why was there no public record of Nathan Monroe's share in Bluegate Express? She remembered her father's office always locked at home, remembered overhearing business calls, stock projections, expansion plans. There had to be paper trails, assets, records. If Douglas and Harvey had stolen the estate, they'd left breadcrumbs. She just had to find them. Her first breakthrough came when she found an archived news article online, dated 2 years earlier, featuring her father in a local business journal. The article praised Bluegate Express's rapid growth and included a photo of Nathan and his co-founder shaking hands in front of a new warehouse. The caption read, "Co-founders Nathan Monroe and James Langley celebrate 10 years of partnership." That was the first official acknowledgement Rachel had seen that her father was more than just an employee. She dug deeper. Secretary of State filings, company registrations, tax ID lookups. Eventually, she discovered that Bluegate Express was registered under a dual ownership LLC. But here's what hit her hardest. Months after her parents' deaths, the company's filings showed a transfer of 38% ownership from Nathan Monroe's stake to an outside party named D.H. Wells Holdings, a shell company incorporated just 2 weeks after the funeral. Rachel survived on coffee, library internet, and blind faith, but she did more than just exist. She studied every free minute, built legal timelines, mapped out the family estate, and kept track of every bank record and corporate filing she could access. What she lacked in formal education, she made up for in obsession. The stolen ownership transfer from her father's company had sparked something deeper in her, a need not only to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, but to understand exactly how it had all been taken. That winter turned into spring, and with it came a rhythm. Work, research, eat, sleep, repeat. Rachel's body began to reflect the strain. Her cheeks thinned, her posture tightened, and her hands were always shaking. But her mind only grew sharper. She discovered that Bluegate Express, the company her father co-founded, had seen a 200% revenue increase in the year before his death. Financial documents filed with the state confirmed her father's equity share, which had been quietly reassigned to D.H. Wells Holdings without any court-ordered probate process. That wasn't just shady, it was illegal. But knowing that and proving it were two different things. Rachel knew she couldn't take this on alone. She needed help, real legal help. But lawyers cost money, and public defenders didn't cover civil probate disputes. Still, she refused to quit. She wrote letters to legal clinics, mailed handwritten appeals to nonprofit firms, and even stood outside courthouses in Manhattan handing out flyers detailing her story. Most people ignored her, but one woman didn't. Her name was Alyssa Chun, a recent Columbia Law graduate who had just opened her own practice and was building a reputation for taking cases others wouldn't touch. Alyssa listened. She asked questions. She reviewed the documents Rachel had gathered in a torn manila folder labeled Monroe Inheritance. After a full week of reviewing, she looked Rachel in the eye and said, "You were robbed, and I think we can prove it." That sentence lit something in Rachel she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Alyssa began drafting motions and collecting affidavits. She coached Rachel on how to organize her evidence, how to request public documents through Freedom of Information laws, and how to prepare for cross-examination. They began preparing a formal claim to reopen probate proceedings and invalidate the forged transfer of estate assets. But building the case took time, and time was something Rachel's body no longer had in abundance. One evening in early May, after 3 straight shifts and a missed lunch, Rachel collapsed behind the diner while taking out the trash. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and everything went black. She woke up in a hospital bed connected to 4, with a nurse gently scolding her for exhaustion and malnutrition. Alyssa sat in the corner with a notepad in her lap and a grim expression on her face. "You're not invincible," Alyssa told her, voice low but firm. "You have to take care of yourself or this all falls apart." Rachel nodded, but her focus was already drifting back to the case. She couldn't afford rest, not yet. The lawsuit had to be filed within the statute of limitations, and the window was closing. The hospital stay forced her to slow down just long enough to write a letter to Carter. She didn't know if it would reach him. She didn't know if Douglas and Harvey were screening their mail. But she wrote it anyway, pouring out everything she'd been doing, assuring him she hadn't abandoned them, and promising she was getting closer. She didn't include details of the legal work, not yet. It wasn't safe. But she signed it with a line she knew he'd recognize. "I'll bring us home. I swear it." 2 weeks later, the envelope was returned, opened, resealed, and marked insufficient address. Rachel stared at the handwriting on the label and recognized Harvey's stiff, blocky script. They were watching. They knew she hadn't given up. That knowledge didn't scare her. It fueled her. Meanwhile, life didn't pause. Noah turned 11 that summer. Rachel marked the date by eating a cupcake from the bakery 2 blocks over and whispering happy birthday out the window, hoping the wind would carry it to him. Eli's middle school team made the regional playoffs, and she watched a grainy live stream from a community center computer, crying quietly in a room full of strangers. Carter's name appeared on a school bulletin posted online, "Honor Roll, Senior Year." He hadn't fallen apart. None of them had. They were surviving too, just like her. The world hadn't taken them down, only scattered them. And Rachel would be the one to bring them back together. Alyssa called one morning in July and said, "We're ready." Their legal team filed a motion to dismiss within 72 hours, calling Rachel's claim baseless, delusional, and manipulative. But Alyssa Chun had anticipated every word. She answered the motion with a counterargument so precise and methodical that the judge didn't just deny the dismissal. He scheduled the case for early discovery. That meant subpoenas. That meant documents. That meant Rachel, after nearly a year of being powerless, could finally ask questions the law would demand be answered. But those answers weren't coming easily. The first set of financial records trickled in with deliberate delay and strategic redactions. Emails were missing. Signatures didn't match. The paper trail surrounding D.H. Wells Holdings was a tangle of shell companies, post office boxes, and banking relationships spread across 3 states. Rachel spent every night after work poring over PDFs and spreadsheets, identifying inconsistencies, building timelines, and drafting questions. Each discrepancy added fuel to her obsession. Why had her uncles transferred company shares just days after the funeral? How did a shell company acquire her father's equity without a court hearing? Why was the insurance payout listed under a trust that her mother never mentioned? The deeper she looked, the more she found, not just irregularities, but impossibilities. According to Bluegate Express records, the ownership transfer had been signed by Nathan Monroe 3 days after his death. Rachel froze when she read that. She stared at the signature, clean and flowing, as if penned by a living hand. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just fraud. This was forgery. And someone had been bold enough to believe they could get away with it. She printed the page and stared at it for an hour. Then she sent it to Alyssa. The response came in minutes. "This changes everything." The next week became a frenzy of preparation. Alyssa filed a motion to compel full disclosure of all documents related to Bluegate Express's ownership history, citing evidence of fraudulent transfer and forged signatures. The motion rattled Douglas and Harvey's attorneys. For the first time, they appeared off balance. They tried to delay proceedings, citing scheduling conflicts and missing documents. But the court wasn't buying it anymore. The judge ordered full production within 14 days. While they waited, Rachel returned to the courthouse records office where she had first begun her search. She asked to view archived probate cases filed around the time of her parents' deaths. A clerk named Megan, who had grown to respect Rachel's persistence, offered to help. Together, they combed through hundreds of pages of filings, looking for anything that had slipped through. That's when Rachel found it, a single-page handwritten letter submitted under a sealed addendum in the weeks after the funeral. It was from her mother, Claire Monroe, dated 6 months prior to the explosion. The letter wasn't a formal will, but it stated her intention that Rachel serve as the primary guardian for her brothers should anything happen to her and Nathan. It included Claire's full name, contact info, and was signed. Though not legally binding on its own, it was evidence of intent, enough to question the uncle's rush to seize control. Rachel's fingers shook as she took photos of every line. She emailed Alyssa immediately. Alyssa's reply was almost instant. "This is a bombshell. We're going to submit it." Armed with the letter, the forged signature, and financial inconsistencies, Alyssa requested an emergency evidentiary hearing. The uncle's lawyers objected loudly. Too fast, too speculative, too emotional. They threw every excuse into their response. But the judge agreed with Alyssa. The hearing was granted. Rachel had 10 days to prepare. She didn't sleep much. Instead, she reviewed every page of evidence over and over until she could quote them in her sleep. She practiced her testimony aloud, imagining the courtroom, the judge's eyes, the pressure. For the first time, she wasn't just researching. She would be speaking, standing, fighting in front of the very system that had once cast her aside. When the day came, she wore the only professional outfit she owned, a blazer 2 sizes too big, slacks she'd hemmed by hand, and shoes that pinched her toes. She didn't care. She walked into the courtroom with her head high and her shoulders square. Douglas and Harvey were already seated with their attorneys, dressed in tailored suits, whispering behind stacks of paperwork. When they saw Rachel, they barely reacted. That coldness, that smug dismissal, it no longer pierced her. She had truth. They had lies. Alyssa led the presentation, opening with the forged documents, explaining the impossible signature date, then revealing the letter from Claire Monroe that clearly named Rachel as her intended guardian. Finally, she displayed a side-by-side comparison of Nathan Monroe's verified signature against the one used in the ownership transfer. The judge asked for a recess. During the break, Rachel sat alone on a bench outside the courtroom, clutching her brother's note in her palm like a charm. The forged signature was a turning point, and the judge's decision to allow expert analysis had created a window Rachel refused to waste. Every evening after working her shift at the diner, she poured herself into the work, determined to trace every dollar, every signature, every transfer connected to her father's name. Alyssa was as relentless as ever, filing request after request, leveraging the court's authority to pry open sealed bank records, hidden accounts, and delayed shareholder filings. And with every document they obtained, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that revealed just how deliberate and premeditated the betrayal truly was. Rachel discovered that 2 days before her father's funeral, a new bank account had been opened under the name D.H. Wells Holdings, using a business registration number linked to a Wyoming LLC, one of the most secretive states in the country for shell corporations. That account received a wire transfer of $4.2 million, marked as equity buyout, and Monroe, supposedly authorized by Nathan himself. But the transaction was approved by Mark Dresden, the same probate attorney who had shown up at her doorstep with Douglas and Harvey. Rachel's stomach turned when she saw Dresden's signature on the wire transfer authorization. He hadn't just stood by as they manipulated the legal system. He had participated directly, playing the role of architect in their fraudulent empire. The money trail didn't stop there. From the D.H. Wells account, $600,000 was funneled into an investment fund registered in the Cayman Islands. Another $1.2 million was used to purchase property under a trust in Westchester County. And then came the most painful revelation of all, a private school tuition payment for Noah, drawn from an account in Harvey Wells's name. Rachel clenched her fists when she saw it, not because her youngest brother was getting an education, but because it meant Harvey had used stolen money to reshape Noah's future while actively keeping Rachel from even seeing him. She remembered standing outside Noah's school, hiding behind a parked car just to get a glimpse of him, unaware that the very man who had forced her away was writing tuition checks from a fortune never meant to be his. It was the kind of truth that made her feel like she was drowning, yet it also gave her the clarity she needed to push forward. Alyssa built a timeline based on these findings and compiled a binder they called The Takeover. It was a 130-page report that detailed how Douglas and Harvey had leveraged their familial proximity, legal manipulation, and forged documents to take control of Bluegate Express, redirect life insurance payouts, and displace the rightful heirs. At the center of it all stood Dresden, the lawyer whose name kept appearing on forms that should have never existed. But to present any of this in court, they needed corroboration, testimony, not just documents. Rachel thought back to her father's co-founder, James Langley, the man in the photo from the article she had found months ago. She tracked him down through a Bluegate employee contact list, still cached in an old website snapshot. After 3 dead phone numbers and 1 awkward voicemail, she finally got a call back. James Langley was cautious at first, skeptical. But when Rachel explained what had happened and mentioned her father's signature appearing on a post-mortem transfer, James went silent for a full minute. Then he said quietly, "That signature wasn't real. I knew the day it showed up." According to James, Nathan had never discussed selling his share, and the supposed buyout came as a complete shock during a board meeting where the documentation was pushed through without James's presence. James had felt something was wrong, but without Rachel or her brothers to challenge it. He had assumed it was part of a private estate deal. When Rachel asked if he would testify, James paused, then said, "I owe your father that much." His willingness gave their case a powerful ally, a first-hand witness who had known Nathan work beside him and could speak directly to his intentions. Alyssa added James to the witness list and began preparing a deposition. In the meantime, the court finally received the results from the handwriting expert. The expert confirmed what Rachel already knew. The signature on the ownership transfer was a forgery. The judge ruled that the estate transfer could not be considered valid and opened the door to a full-scale investigation of D.H. Wells Holdings. This decision forced Douglas and Harvey into a new strategy. No longer silent, they began filing motions accusing Rachel of harassment, claiming emotional distress, and suggesting she was exploiting her brothers for personal gain. Rachel read those statements with a mix of disgust and disbelief. For a year, she had worked until her body collapsed, starved herself, studied law, fought alone, only to be painted as a manipulator. But public opinion was shifting. The media caught wind of the case, thanks to a journalist Alyssa discreetly contacted. The headline appeared in the Metro Times 2 days later, "Orphaned and Robbed. One sister's legal fight against a $4 million inheritance scheme." Rachel's photo wasn't included, but her story was, and it struck a nerve. Comment sections filled with outrage. Strangers offered support. Pro bono investigators reached out, offering help digging into the Wells brothers' finances. They were ready. They had spent the last 3 weeks preparing depositions, organizing exhibits, prepping witnesses, and fine-tuning their arguments. They had the expert handwriting analysis confirming forgery, the financial records showing money funneled through offshore accounts, the sealed letter from Claire Monroe naming Rachel as guardian, and most recently, the sworn deposition from James Langley, who had confirmed under oath that the ownership transfer of Bluegate Express was never authorized by Nathan Monroe. That testimony had shaken Douglas and Harvey's legal team so badly they filed 2 separate motions to have it struck from the record, both of which were denied. Rachel had watched the brothers' facade begin to crumble, but today was about more than damage. It was about demolition. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, court staff, and the Wells family, but with members of the press, law students, and a few curious spectators who had followed the Metro Times article and wanted to see the woman who had taken on her own blood and refused to back down. Rachel took her seat at the plaintiff's table, her palms flat against the cool wood. Across from her, Douglas and Harvey sat with expressions carved from stone, surrounded by their expensive legal team. Their suits were crisp, their faces unreadable, but Rachel noticed the way Harvey tapped his fingers beneath the table, the subtle twitch in Douglas's jaw. They were nervous. Good. The judge entered and called the court to order. Opening arguments began. Alyssa's voice rang with control and precision, her cadence deliberate, every sentence measured. She laid out the story clearly, beginning with the explosion that killed Nathan and Claire Monroe, then moving into the timeline of forged documents, asset theft, fraudulent legal filings, and custody interference. She spoke of Rachel's attempts to gain guardianship, the uncle's calculated obstruction, and the overwhelming evidence of a coordinated scheme to strip the Monroe children of their inheritance. The defense responded with manufactured concern. Their lead attorney called Rachel's claims a tragic misunderstanding fueled by grief, accused her of waging a vendetta, and dismissed the forged signature as a clerical error misinterpreted by a biased expert. Rachel didn't flinch. When the first witness was called, it was the forensic handwriting analyst. He walked the court through his methodology, explained the biometric markers he used, and concluded that the signature used to transfer Nathan Monroe's company shares posthumously could not have been written by the deceased. When the defense tried to discredit him, Alyssa countered with his credentials: 20 years of courtroom experience and a record of testimony in over 80 civil and criminal cases. The expert held firm. Next came James Langley. He stepped into the witness box and introduced himself as co-founder of Bluegate Express, lifelong friend of Nathan Monroe, and current CEO of what he now described as a company poisoned by betrayal. He testified that he had never seen or approved any documentation regarding a buyout from Nathan, and confirmed that he had been kept away from the transaction that gave D.H. Wells Holdings control. When asked why he hadn't acted sooner, he looked at Rachel and said, "Because I didn't know the truth until she showed it to me." His statement landed with force. The defense flailed, attempting to raise doubts, but the documents spoke louder. Internal emails revealed timelines that didn't match. Signatures didn't align. Bank transfers were authorized by people without the legal right to access those accounts. Piece by piece, the puzzle Rachel had spent a year assembling was placed before the court, and the picture it painted was damning. On the third day of the hearing, Rachel took the stand. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, standing in front of the mirror in her apartment, repeating answers, practicing breathing techniques. But nothing compared to the silence that filled the room when she sat under oath and faced the people who had taken everything from her. Alyssa asked the questions with care, guiding Rachel through the timeline of her parents' death, her guardianship petition, the night she was removed from her home, the discovery of the forged documents, and the years spent working, surviving, and investigating. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't drift. She looked straight ahead, her words clear and steady. When the defense cross-examined her, their tone sharpened. They called her emotional, inexperienced, even suggested that she was motivated by resentment over not being chosen as executor of the estate. Rachel answered without hesitation, "I wasn't chosen because there was no will filed. I filed for guardianship, not for money. I wanted my brothers to be safe." Her voice cracked only once, when asked why she continued the case after being removed from the home. She took a breath, steadied herself, and said, "Because my parents would have wanted me to protect them. And because they can't speak for themselves now, I have to." The judge didn't react, but the silence that followed was thick with impact. Closing arguments came quickly. The defense leaned heavily on the idea of family misunderstanding, claiming that Rachel was misguided, that Dresden had made mistakes but not committed fraud, and that the financial transfers were part of a legal process handled improperly, not maliciously. Alyssa dismantled that argument with evidence. She ended her remarks by placing Noah's school tuition document beside the court file and saying, "They used stolen money to raise a child while keeping his sister on the street. If that's not malicious, then what is?" The courtroom held its breath. The judge called for a recess to deliberate. Rachel stepped outside and sat on a stone bench in the courtyard, her hands folded in her lap, Alyssa pacing nearby. Minutes passed like hours. Now she was back, not as a visitor or a victim, but as the court-appointed executor of the Monroe estate, a title she had earned through months of brutal investigation, courtroom warfare, and sleepless nights studying probate law while her body ached from diner shifts. The legal victory had not just exposed the fraud orchestrated by her uncles Douglas and Harvey. It had begun to unwind the entire web they had spun. The court's ruling invalidated the forged documents, reversed the fraudulent transfer of company assets, and froze all accounts linked to D.H. Wells Holdings pending a full forensic audit. Rachel was now legally authorized to act on behalf of her parents' estate, which meant she could finally begin to correct the injustices done to her family. But the ruling also came with responsibility. She had to manage the distribution of assets, oversee pending disputes, and most importantly, file a formal petition to restore custody of her brothers. Family court was the next battlefield. Custody had been entangled in the civil proceedings from the start, but now it was its own legal front, complete with home studies, psychological evaluations, and guardian ad litem interviews. Rachel didn't flinch. She met every requirement head-on, from submitting her rental lease agreement to documenting her work history and providing references from her manager at Patsy's Diner and Alyssa herself. The process was invasive, exhausting, and slow, but Rachel refused to show frustration. This was the final gate, and she would walk through it. In the meantime, she visited her brothers for the first time in 10 months. The court granted a supervised meeting at a neutral location, a small family center with cheerful murals and a coffee machine that made watery cocoa. When the boys walked in, Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Carter was taller, more serious, his shoulders tense beneath a zip-up hoodie. Eli had grown out his hair and stood with one hand in his pocket, a defensive posture Rachel recognized from when he was 7 and caught breaking curfew. But it was Noah who made her knees buckle, his eyes wide, then immediately brimming with tears as he ran across the room and threw himself into her arms. She held all 3 of them that afternoon, cried and laughed and apologized, even though they told her she didn't have to. Carter asked questions about the court case, the estate, the house, and Rachel answered every one, knowing he had carried too much responsibility for a 17-year-old. Eli didn't speak much, but he didn't let go of her hand. Noah never left her lap. They had survived apart, but they were stronger together. After that meeting, Rachel worked harder than ever. She met with Bluegate's board of directors and began the process of restoring her father's stake. James Langley helped push through a vote to reinstate the Monroe Trust as a major shareholder, giving Rachel control over decisions involving dividends and future investment strategies. The company, which had once been used as a tool of betrayal, was now returning to the family that helped build it. But reclaiming the company also meant facing the damage done under Douglas and Harvey's brief but destructive tenure. Several employees had been fired unfairly, contracts manipulated, and small business partners pushed out in favor of shady corporate alliances. Rachel demanded audits, rehired 2 whistleblowers who had been silenced, and pledged transparency going forward. Her name carried weight now, not because she had inherited it, but because she had fought for it. While managing all of this, Rachel received notice that the custody hearing was scheduled for mid-November. She prepared with Alyssa, who now handled both family and probate law for her. They gathered statements from teachers, therapists, and family friends who attested to Rachel's commitment, character, and the trauma the boys had endured under the Wells brothers' care. The day of the hearing, Rachel dressed not to impress, but to represent the truth. Simple, clean lines, no embellishments. Her mother's silver bracelet around her wrist. She testified calmly, answering every question with clarity and honesty. When asked why she believed she was the best guardian, she said, "Because I never stopped fighting for them, even when no one else would." Carter testified too. He stood in front of the judge and said, "My sister was the only adult in my life who didn't lie to me." Eli followed, delivering a quiet but powerful statement about feeling disconnected from himself while living with the uncles, how he had started skipping meals and sleeping in closets because he felt like a burden. Noah didn't testify directly, but the court-appointed child psychologist submitted a glowing report stating that Noah showed signs of severe separation anxiety that only calmed during visits with Rachel. The court deliberated for 2 days, then delivered its ruling. Custody of Carter, Eli, and Noah was returned to Rachel Monroe, effective immediately. The moment she heard the decision, Rachel broke down in Alyssa's arms. The weight of every sleepless night, every legal roadblock, every moment of helplessness crashing through her in a tidal wave of relief. The boys moved in with her a week later, into a 2-bedroom apartment she had upgraded to just in time. The room was small, but it was theirs. They shared a bunk bed, cooked simple meals, and took turns choosing movies at night. Rachel returned to NYU part-time through online courses, and Carter enrolled at a local community college. Eli got a skateboard for his 15th birthday, and Noah started drawing again. Her uncles, Douglas and Harvey, were facing mounting legal consequences, but there was still a deeper layer of this conspiracy Rachel hadn't fully uncovered, something buried further in the past. something that didn't make sense. Despite all the stolen assets, forged signatures, and shell companies, Rachel couldn't shake one detail that haunted her since the first day she saw the fire report: the explosion itself. Her parents' death was officially ruled an accident caused by a faulty gas line, but Rachel remembered clearly that her father had installed a new system only months before, obsessively checking it himself, and even hiring a private inspector to sign off on the work. Nathan Monroe was many things: methodical, cautious, and above all else, protective of his family. The idea that he would have overlooked something so dangerous didn't sit right. And now that she had legal authority, access to the estate, and backing from investigators, she was in a position to ask new questions. It started with a simple request. She submitted a petition to retrieve the original inspection reports from the city's building department and reached out to the private contractor her father had hired for the renovations, Alan Fisk. Alan was hesitant at first, but when Rachel mentioned her name, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he agreed to meet. They sat at a diner on the edge of Westchester County, Rachel nursing a cup of bitter coffee, while Alan, a balding man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a voice roughened by decades of sawdust and secondhand smoke, pulled out a worn folder and slid it across the table. Inside were photocopies of permits, inspection sign-offs, and a report dated 2 months before the explosion that clearly stated, "No safety hazards observed. Gas line compliant. No further maintenance required." Alan leaned in and said quietly, "Your father triple-checked everything. He was paranoid about that system. Told me if anything ever happened, it wouldn't be by accident." Rachel felt her blood go cold. If the gas line wasn't faulty, then what had caused the explosion? She requested the fire marshal's full report, and this time, with her legal status and Alyssa's assistance, she received more than the sanitized summary she'd seen after the funeral. The full report raised red flags. The point of ignition had been traced to a junction that had shown signs of tampering, scratched fittings, mismatched seals, and trace residues inconsistent with standard gas leaks. The language was buried in technical jargon, but the implication was there. Someone had altered the line. Rachel brought the report to Alyssa, who stared at it in silence for several minutes before saying, "We need a second opinion." They hired an independent fire investigator, someone Alyssa trusted from a previous case, who reviewed the evidence and concluded that while the explosion had appeared accidental, there were multiple indicators that the leak was artificially induced. He used the term sabotage cautiously, but did not dismiss it. The theory hit Rachel like a freight train. For months she had been fighting to reclaim her family's legacy, assuming her parents had died tragically and everything afterward had been opportunistic theft. But what if it hadn't started with the explosion? What if the explosion had been the beginning of the plan? She pulled out the timeline again and laid every event side by side. The explosion, the uncles arriving within 72 hours with a lawyer, the immediate transfer of business ownership, the creation of D.H. Wells Holdings, and the forged documents, all happening within days, even hours of her parents' death. The precision of it all no longer seemed reactive, it felt orchestrated. Rachel couldn't accuse her uncles of murder without evidence, and the fire investigator was careful not to use the word arson, but there was enough circumstantial data to warrant further scrutiny. Alyssa contacted the district attorney's office, which had already opened an investigation into financial fraud. Now, with the new evidence, they added a criminal inquiry into the cause of the explosion. A subpoena was issued to examine Dresden's correspondence around the date of the explosion, and buried within a deleted email cache recovered from a law office backup server was a message sent 2 days before the fire. All documents are in place. As soon as the transition is confirmed, we move forward. DH expects immediate filing. The email was vague but alarming. It suggested premeditation, knowledge of an impending transition, and coordination between Dresden and the Wells brothers. The DA's office moved swiftly. A grand jury was convened, and Rachel was called to testify, not about the financial documents this time, but about the days leading up to the explosion, what she remembered, what her father had said, what she had observed. She told them everything. How Nathan had been on edge in the final weeks, working longer hours, making cryptic remarks about cleaning house, and getting things in writing. He had been preparing something, possibly a new will, possibly a restructuring of the business, but Rachel never saw the final result. The grand jury proceedings were sealed, but Rachel received confirmation that an indictment was being considered, not just for fraud, but for conspiracy to commit criminal negligence resulting in death. If charges were filed, it would be the final blow to the empire Douglas, and Harvey tried to build atop her parents' grave. She knew this hearing could be the culmination of all her efforts or the moment everything unraveled. Alyssa Chun, her lawyer and partner in this fight, had secured every piece of evidence, lined up every witness, and prepared Rachel for the barrage of cross-examination she would face. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, filled not just with legal teams and family members, but with reporters covering a story that had captured public attention for its layers of greed, betrayal, and resilience. As Rachel entered, memories surged. A young girl fighting to protect her brothers, a woman transformed by fire and loss, a fighter refusing to back down. The judge called the court to order, and Alyssa opened with a compelling summary that wove together the timeline of events. The suspicious explosion that killed Nathan and Claire Monroe, the immediate and calculated takeover of the estate by Douglas and Harvey, the forged documents that rewrote a family's legacy, and the efforts Rachel had made to reclaim what was rightfully hers and her brothers. She laid out the findings of the independent fire investigator who testified the explosion was likely caused by sabotage, the financial forensic accountant who traced millions funneled through offshore accounts, and the handwriting expert who confirmed forged signatures. The defense tried to spin a story of miscommunication and family misunderstandings, accusing Rachel of fabricating evidence and trying to destroy her uncle's reputation. But when Mark Dresden, the disgraced attorney, took the stand, the atmosphere shifted. Dresden, who had once orchestrated the fraudulent paperwork, testified under immunity agreement. His voice was shaky as he confessed to destroying Nathan Monroe's original will and forging documents at the Wells brothers' behest. He admitted they had planned to wrest control of Bluegate Express and the estate to secure their own financial futures, regardless of the impact on the children. Rachel's heart pounded as she listened. This was the moment the truth was laid bare, and it cut deeper than any legal victory. Following Dresden's testimony, James Langley recounted the moment he realized something was wrong, sharing personal anecdotes about his friendship with Nathan and his suspicions about the sudden business changes. The courtroom listened intently as Carter, now 19, took the stand. Calm and articulate, he described the years of uncertainty, the feeling of being torn from a life they knew, and the courage it took to hold onto hope. Eli spoke next, recounting the emotional toll of losing his parents and living under the uncle's care, while Noah, now 15, submitted a heartfelt written statement expressing his longing for family and normalcy. When Rachel finally testified, she spoke with quiet strength, detailing her discovery of the forged documents, the financial trail, and the personal pain of losing her parents and fighting to reunite her family. The cross-examination was intense, but Rachel remained composed, her answers precise and unwavering. Alyssa's closing argument was a call for justice, not just for the Monroe family, but for every victim of greed and betrayal. She emphasized the resilience of Rachel and her brothers and asked the jury to hold Douglas and Harvey accountable for their actions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts of fraud, forgery, financial theft, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced Douglas and Harvey Wells to significant prison terms, ordered restitution payments to the Monroe family, and issued a formal apology recognizing the pain inflicted on Rachel and her brothers. As the gavel struck, Rachel felt a wave of relief, sorrow, and hope wash over her. This was more than a legal victory. It was a restoration of truth, a reclaiming of her family's dignity, and a promise that justice, though delayed, had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, but Rachel focused on the 3 young men beside her: her brothers, her family, her strength. They had survived the darkest storms together, and now they were free to build a future on their own terms. Rachel Monroe sat quietly in her spacious office overlooking downtown New York, the skyline glowing in the late afternoon light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. The journey from the cold, cramped apartment above the Yonkers laundromat to this moment had been long and filled with hardship, heartbreak, and relentless determination. Yet, despite all the wealth she had reclaimed and the legal victories she had won, Rachel understood that the greatest inheritance she had ever received was not measured in dollars or properties, but in the unbreakable bond of family, the lessons of resilience, and the promise of justice. After the courtroom battles that stripped her uncles of their ill-gotten gains and restored her family's rightful legacy, Rachel devoted herself to more than business success. With the Monroe Legacy Foundation, she worked to protect families like hers, those caught in the crosshairs of greed and deception, those struggling to keep siblings together, and those seeking hope in the darkest of times. The foundation provided emergency legal aid, financial support for guardianship cases, and educational scholarships for children displaced by family disputes. Rachel met regularly with families whose stories mirrored her own, listening deeply, offering guidance, and reminding them that they were not alone. But the real triumph lay in her brothers, who had grown into men defined not by their trauma, but by their strength and compassion. Carter had graduated with honors and launched a nonprofit focused on mentoring youth in underserved communities, channeling the leadership skills he'd honed while protecting his younger brothers. Eli pursued a degree in psychology, driven by his desire to help children heal from the kinds of emotional wounds he once carried. Noah, once the quietest of the three, had blossomed into a gifted artist whose paintings told stories of struggle and hope, gaining recognition in local galleries. Together, they remained fiercely connected, gathering every Sunday morning for pancakes, a ritual Rachel had started years ago in their tiny apartment to remind them of family, love, and perseverance. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel stood in front of a packed auditorium at a conference on family law reform, invited to speak as a survivor and advocate. Her voice was steady and clear as she shared her story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of tenacity and truth. She spoke about the importance of protecting vulnerable children, the dangers of unchecked greed, and the need for accessible legal support. Our greatest inheritance, she said, is not the money left behind, but the values we pass forward: love, justice, and the courage to stand up when it matters most. After the speech, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes, telling Rachel how much her story gave her hope during her own fight for guardianship. Rachel hugged her tightly, feeling the full circle of the legacy she was building, not just for her family, but for countless others. She often thought back to that night years ago, sitting alone with Noah's crayon note in her hand. Back then, the future was terrifying and uncertain, but she had made a promise to never give up, to keep her family together. Today, that promise had become a life's work. The past would always be a part of them, the scars, the losses, the betrayals, but they had turned those wounds into wisdom, their pain into purpose. Rachel looked out her office window at the bustling city below, knowing that their story was far from over. It was now a beacon for those still struggling, a reminder that even when everything seems lost, love and justice can prevail. She closed her eyes briefly, whispered a thank you to her parents, and smiled. Their legacy wasn't just in the fortune they left behind, but in the family that refused to be broken. They were Monroe, strong, unyielding, and forever united. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more inspiring and powerful tales. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot resonated with you the most? Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything and helps keep these stories coming.